¿Alguna vez te has sentido llamado a algo más grande, pero al mismo tiempo enfrentaste debilidades que parecían alejarte de tu propósito? La historia de Sansón refleja nuestra propia lucha entre la fuerza y la vulnerabilidad, las decisiones equivocadas y la redención. En este vídeo, damos vida a este viaje épico como nunca antes, con una animación cautivadora que tocará tu alma e inspirará tu fe. Descubre cómo las lecciones de Sansón pueden transformar la manera en que enfrentas tus desafíos hoy.
In ancient times, the people of Israel lived under the cruel rule of the Philistines. For 40 years, the Israelites faced oppression, and it seemed there was no hope for deliverance. Yet God never abandons his people, and amidst this dark period, a light began to shine within a humble family. There was a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan, and his wife, whose name is not mentioned in the Bible. Despite being God-fearing, they faced great sorrow. They were unable to have children. Every day, Manoah's wife carried the burden of silence in her home, the emptiness of not hearing children's laughter. But God had a special plan for this family. One day, while Manoah's wife was alone, busy with her daily tasks, something extraordinary happened. A man appeared before her, but he was no ordinary man. He had a divine presence, with a radiant countenance so compelling she could not look away. This man was the angel of the Lord, sent directly by God with a message that would change their lives forever. The angel spoke tenderly, saying, "Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son." Those words deeply touched her heart. A promise from God was delivered directly to her. But the angel did not stop there. He gave very specific instructions about the child who would be born. "Now, be careful not to drink wine or strong drink, nor eat anything unclean. For you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines." What did it mean to be a Nazarite? It was a sacred vow of separation to God. This boy would not be allowed to cut his hair, consume alcoholic beverages, or touch anything unclean. He would be dedicated to the Lord even before birth, and his life would have a clear purpose, to deliver the people of Israel. Imagine the impact of these words on the woman's heart. She, who had never been able to conceive, was now to be the mother of someone chosen by God for such a grand purpose. Overwhelmed with emotion, she ran to tell her husband everything that had happened. "A man of God came to me. His face was like that of an angel, very awesome. I didn't ask where he came from, nor did he tell me his name, but he said I would have a son who would be consecrated to God from the womb." Manoah, deeply moved by his wife's account, wanted to know more about how to raise this special child. In an act of faith, he prayed to the Lord. "O Lord, I beg you, let the man of God whom you sent come to us again to teach us what we should do for the boy who is to be born." And God heard Manoah's prayer. The angel returned once more, appearing to Manoah's wife while she was in the field. This time, she ran to tell Manoah that the heavenly visitor had returned. Together, they went to meet the angel. Manoah reverently asked, "When your words come true, what is to be the boy's rule of life and mission?" The angel clearly reaffirmed the instructions. "Your wife must abstain from all that I have commanded her. She must not consume anything from the vine, nor drink strong drink, nor eat anything unclean. She must observe all that I commanded." Recognizing the magnitude of the moment, Manoah wanted to offer something to the celestial visitor, though he still didn't fully understand who he was. "Please, let us prepare a young goat for you," he said. But the angel replied, "Though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord." It was then that Manoah realized he was in the presence of a divine messenger. He prepared the sacrifice, and as he placed it on the rock, something astonishing happened. When the flame of the offering ascended to heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended with it, vanishing into the smoke. Manoah and his wife fell face down, awestruck and fearful. "We will surely die, for we have seen God," Manoah exclaimed. But his wife, with wisdom, reassured him. "If the Lord wanted to kill us, he would not have accepted the offering nor shown us all these things." With hearts full of hope and faith, they awaited the fulfillment of the divine promise. And, as the Lord had said, the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. They named him Samson, and the boy grew under God's blessing, destined to fulfill the mission written for him even before his birth. Imagine a hot day on a lonely road, where the wind blew fiercely, cutting through the silence of the landscape. This was the setting in which Samson, a strong and courageous man, found himself. He, still young, was heading to Timnah, a Philistine city, on a mission given to him by God. What many didn't know was that Samson was not just an ordinary man, he had been set apart for God from birth. His incredible strength came from the Spirit of the Lord, who guided and empowered him. It was this divine strength that made him capable of feats that no one else could perform. As he walked alone, unaware of what awaited him, Samson was confronted by something unexpected, a lion. Suddenly, this majestic and feared animal appeared before him, with fierce eyes and roars that echoed down the road. The lion, with its imposing mane and sharp claws, seemed ready to attack. The natural response for many would have been to fight back, but for Samson, there was something more. He was not alone. The Spirit of the Lord, who was with him, descended upon him with power. Without hesitation, Samson, with strength that was not his own but given by God, seized the lion. He tore it apart with his bare hands as if it were a mere goat, without any difficulty. The scene is almost impossible to imagine, the mighty lion, considered the king of the jungle, being defeated by an ordinary man. But this was not ordinary. This was divine intervention. God was with Samson, strengthening him to fulfill his purpose. After this astonishing feat, Samson did not tell anyone what had happened. He simply continued on his way, without boasting about his victory. This reveals something important about Samson's character. He knew his strength was not for show, but to fulfill God's will. This encounter with the lion was not only a test of physical strength but also a sign that God was with him, empowering him for great deeds. Samson, with this supernatural strength, was about to embark on a journey where his strength would be tested, his faith challenged, and he would become the instrument of deliverance for the people of Israel. And it all started there, at that moment when he defeated the lion with the help of the Spirit of the Lord. It was more than just a fight, it was a demonstration that Samson, though young, was being shaped for something grand. And what happened to the lion? Well, that would be only the beginning of a life full of victories and challenges for Samson, the man whom God chose to be a tool in his hands. It was a day of celebration. Samson, the great hero of Israel, was about to marry a young Philistine woman, in a wedding that was supposed to be a joyful feast for everyone. But, as often happens in the stories involving Samson, something unexpected was about to occur. During the wedding festivities, Samson, with a mischievous smile, stood before the Philistines, his guests, and made a peculiar proposition. He said, "I will give you a riddle. If you can solve it within 7 days, I will give you 30 linen shirts and 30 sets of clothes. But if you can't, you will have to give me the same. Are you ready?" The Philistines, confident in their intelligence, accepted the challenge. Samson then spoke the riddle, which seemed simple at first glance, but was extremely difficult to decipher. Out of the eater came food, and out of the strong came sweetness. The guests fell silent. What did this mean? No one could understand, and the hours began to pass. The riddle seemed simple, but there was no obvious answer. And as the days dragged on, the tension grew. Samson's wife, noticing the difficulty the Philistines were having, began to feel pressured. She feared the Philistines wouldn't be able to solve the riddle, and consequently, they would lose the bet. So, in a moment of weakness, she began to beg Samson to reveal the answer. "Please, tell me what the riddle means. I can't stand seeing the Philistines so upset. They are threatening to humiliate me if they don't solve it." Samson, however, did not want to make things easier. He had proposed the riddle as a way to have fun with his enemies, and he was not about to simply reveal the answer. But, over time, Samson's wife insisted so much, pleading and crying, that he finally gave in. "All right, I'll tell you. But only because you insisted so much. The riddle is about the lion I killed, and then, when I came back to its carcass, I found a hive of bees inside it. The lion, which seemed strong and unbeatable, became the source of sweetness when the bees made honey inside it." With this revelation, Samson's wife rushed to the Philistines, eager to deliver the answer. And so, on the last day of the bet, the Philistines finally presented the solution to the hero of Israel. What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? Samson, surprised, knew something was wrong. He felt betrayed, as he knew his wife had revealed the secret. Furious, he responded to the Philistines. "If it weren't for your help, you would never have figured out the answer. Now, because you have deceived me, there will be consequences." Samson, in his rage, set off on a quest for vengeance, and his life, already marked by challenges and battles, took an even more unpredictable turn. It was a time of great oppression for the people of Israel, and the Philistines, sworn enemies, were everywhere. Samson, the man chosen by God to free the Israelites, was in constant war against them, and his unparalleled strength made him a target of hatred. But Samson, like many heroes, also knew the weight of betrayal. It all began after he was deceived by his Philistine wife, who, under pressure, revealed his secret to the Philistines, the source of his strength. Without his Nazirite vow, Samson lost his strength and was captured. But, over time, he recovered and became more determined than ever to seek justice, even if it meant facing great dangers. After being freed, Samson knew he needed to pay the Philistines back for the humiliation he suffered, and an audacious idea sprang to his mind. It was an idea that would make the Philistines suffer in their wealth that they loved so much, their crops. Samson went to the fields and, with his own hands, captured many foxes. He didn't just release them haphazardly, but tied them in pairs, fastening a lit torch between them. Imagine the scene. A fox with a lit torch tied to its tail, running wildly, while its partner also ran with fire on its rear. The fire spread quickly, and the foxes, scared and disoriented, ran in all directions, consuming everything in their path. The destruction was immense. The Philistines' crops, which were the sustenance of their wealth and food, burned in flames. The wheat fields, vineyards, and olive trees, which were precious to the Philistines, were devastated in one night of terror. The foxes, with flames trailing behind them, ran uncontrollably, spreading fire everywhere, without mercy. Those who saw from afar, not understanding what was happening, could only watch in shock as the fire consumed everything. The Philistines were furious when they saw their wealth in flames, and Samson's revenge spread quickly. He had done something they couldn't even predict, using nature itself against them, and the destruction that followed was a reflection of God's power in his life. But behind this act of vengeance, there was more than just anger or a desire for destruction. Samson was bringing justice. He knew that the victory would not only be over the Philistines, but over the oppression his people had suffered. It was as if every fox with the torch was a symbol of resistance, of struggle, and of hope. Samson, with his strength and ingenuity, was fulfilling his purpose to free the Israelites, no matter the cost. And so, the Philistines, now with their fields destroyed and their wealth burned, understood that Samson was not just a strong man. He was God's tool, and his vengeance, though fierce, was a sign that the Israelites could finally rise against their oppressors. The battle with the donkey's jawbone is one of the most impressive moments in Samson's life, where his supernatural strength, granted by God, is manifested in an entirely uncommon way. Imagine the scene: Samson, alone, facing a Philistine army. They, knowing his strength, had come after him to capture him, to finally defeat the man who had caused them so much pain. But Samson, with unwavering courage, was not intimidated. He knew the Lord was with him. That day, he was not armed with a sword, a shield, or any other conventional weapon. In fact, he had no weapon at all. But then, something unusual happened. He found the jawbone of a donkey, a simple animal bone, lying on the ground. It was an object seemingly useless to anyone else, but to Samson, that piece of bone would become the most powerful weapon he could wield. With the jawbone in hand, Samson prepared for what was to come. The Philistines, confident in their numbers and strength, advanced on him, perhaps laughing and thinking it would be easy to defeat him. But they did not know what they were about to face. Samson, with a strength that could only come from God, began to fight the Philistines. Each blow he struck with the donkey's jawbone knocked down an enemy. The sound of the bone hitting the Philistines echoed, and with each movement, more and more enemies were defeated. He did not stop, he showed no signs of fatigue. The battle seemed to last for hours, but Samson was unbeatable. At first, the Philistines probably thought they could simply surround him and trap him, but soon realized that would not be possible. Samson's strength had no limits. He was like an enraged lion, pounding against his enemies with uncontrollable power. When it seemed like all was lost for the Philistines, and the number of their fallen warriors was already piling up around Samson, he finally raised the donkey's jawbone one last time and struck down a few more of his adversaries. In the end, Samson had defeated 1,000 Philistines alone, using nothing but a donkey's bone. The scene was devastating for Israel's enemies but glorious for those who watched, for it confirmed something everyone knew deep down: Samson did not fight alone. The strength he used came directly from God. As the dust of the battle began to settle, Samson paused for a moment, looking around. He had won, but it was not just a physical victory. It was a clear demonstration that God was with him and would use him to deliver Israel. With humility, he recognized that it was the Lord who gave him strength and then prayed a prayer of gratitude. With the same intensity with which he had fought, Samson now acknowledged God's presence in his life, and the people of Israel, watching from afar, knew that God's deliverer was back. The battle with the donkey's jawbone is one of the most impressive moments in Samson's life, where his supernatural strength, granted by God, is manifested in an entirely uncommon way. Imagine the scene: Samson, alone, facing a Philistine army. They, knowing his strength, had come after him to capture him, to finally defeat the man who had caused them so much pain. But Samson, with unwavering courage, was not intimidated. He knew the Lord was with him. That day, he was not armed with a sword, a shield, or any other conventional weapon. In fact, he had no weapon at all. But then, something unusual happened. He found the jawbone of a donkey, a simple animal bone, lying on the ground. It was an object seemingly useless to anyone else, but to Samson, that piece of bone would become the most powerful weapon he could wield. With the jawbone in hand, Samson prepared for what was to come. The Philistines, confident in their numbers and strength, advanced on him, perhaps laughing and thinking it would be easy to defeat him. But they did not know what they were about to face. Samson, with a strength that could only come from God, began to fight the Philistines. Each blow he struck with the donkey's jawbone knocked down an enemy. The sound of the bone hitting the Philistines echoed, and with each movement, more and more enemies were defeated. He did not stop, he showed no signs of fatigue. The battle seemed to last for hours, but Samson was unbeatable. At first, the Philistines probably thought they could simply surround him and trap him, but soon realized that would not be possible. Samson's strength had no limits. He was like an enraged lion, pounding against his enemies with uncontrollable power. When it seemed like all was lost for the Philistines, and the number of their fallen warriors was already piling up around Samson, he finally raised the donkey's jawbone one last time and struck down a few more of his adversaries. In the end, Samson had defeated 1,000 Philistines alone, using nothing but a donkey's bone. The scene was devastating for Israel's enemies but glorious for those who watched, for it confirmed something everyone knew deep down: Samson did not fight alone. The strength he used came directly from God. As the dust of the battle began to settle, Samson paused for a moment, looking around. He had won, but it was not just a physical victory. It was a clear demonstration that God was with him and would use him to deliver Israel. With humility, he recognized that it was the Lord who gave him strength and then prayed a prayer of gratitude. With the same intensity with which he had fought, Samson now acknowledged God's presence in his life, and the people of Israel, watching from afar, knew that God's deliverer was back. Imagine the scene: a strong, unbeatable man, known for his supernatural strength, who made the enemies of Israel tremble with fear, now finds himself in a situation he never imagined. Samson, the great hero, had fallen in love with Delilah, a woman of irresistible beauty, but one who hid something far more dangerous behind her eyes. And it is here that the story takes a bitter turn, for, unknowingly, Samson was walking straight into a trap he could not foresee. Delilah was approached by the Philistines, the enemies of Israel, with a tempting offer: "Find out the secret of his strength, and you will be rewarded with great wealth." They knew that Samson was invincible because of his Nazirite vow, and behind his strength was a promise made to God: he should never cut his hair. But as Delilah, with her charm and cunning, had won Samson's heart, she saw the opportunity for great power in her hands. Delilah then began to ask Samson repeatedly, with a soft smile and a sweet voice, "Samson, please tell me the secret of your strength. How do you manage to do such incredible things? How is it possible that you have this strength, that no one else has?" She used her beauty and charm, but also her sharp words, which insisted without pause. Samson, suspicious at first, resisted. He knew something was wrong, but his passion for Delilah made him give in. He gave her a wrong answer, playing with the situation. "If you bind my arms with 7 new ropes, I won't be able to move," he said. But, instead of being alarmed, Delilah immediately ran to the Philistines and, with a smile on her face, set up the trap. When the Philistines hid in the next room, Delilah bound Samson with the 7 new ropes and cried out, "Samson, the Philistines are coming." He got up, stretched out his arms, and, as always, broke the ropes as if they were made of straw. But Delilah did not give up. She knew there was more he wasn't telling her. Her expression now was one of frustration mixed with the desire to learn the secret. "You've deceived me, Samson. Tell me the truth. What makes you so strong?" With each of her words, he felt the pressure, and she used his love to try to convince him that, if he really loved her, he would trust her and reveal his secret. But he still didn't give in immediately. Samson, with a mixture of affection and care, gave another answer: "Bind me with new, strong ropes, and I won't be able to move." Once again, Delilah ran to the Philistines, set up the trap, and when the Philistines approached, she cried out, but once again, Samson broke the ropes effortlessly. The game between them continued, and Delilah was growing more impatient. "You're mocking me, Samson. You don't love me." With a broken heart and more determined than ever, Delilah used another strategy. She pleaded, "Tell me the truth, and you no longer need to deceive me. I love you, and I want to know who you really are." Finally, in a moment of vulnerability, Samson gave in. He told Delilah the secret of his strength: "If my hair is cut, my strength will go away, for I am a Nazirite devoted to God from birth." He didn't know that by sharing the secret with her, he was sealing his fate. Delilah, now knowing what she needed to do, kissed him with a victorious smile but hid the fact that she was about to betray him. That night, when Samson fell asleep in her lap, Delilah cut his hair slowly with a sharp scissor. The hair that represented his devotion to God fell to the floor, and with it, his strength that made him so feared. She had violated Samson's sacred vow, and he was completely vulnerable. Delilah, without hesitation, called the Philistines, who, like a swarm, stormed into the house and captured him. Samson, unaware of what had happened, woke up and tried to rise, but something was wrong. He no longer had the supernatural strength that always accompanied him. He thought he could shake off the Philistines as he had before, but when he tried to move, he realized he was weak, helpless, and they easily captured him. His eyes were gouged out, and he was imprisoned and taken to the Philistine city, where he was publicly humiliated. This betrayal by Delilah, which Samson never imagined she was capable of, not only stole his physical strength but also cost him his freedom and his honor. He was now at the mercy of the Philistines, who saw him as a joke, a broken man without his strength, without his hope. However, as we will see, what seemed like a total defeat was only just beginning to reveal God's plans for Samson. Samson's capture is one of the most dramatic moments in his story. He, who was the strongest man in Israel, now finds himself vulnerable and defeated after Delilah's betrayal, who cut his hair and broke his vow with God. After losing his strength, Samson was captured by the Philistines. They, who feared him because of his feats and supernatural strength, finally managed to deceive and defeat him. What happened next was a scene of humiliation. Samson was bound and led by a large group of Philistines to Gaza, the main Philistine city. What was once a feared man was now treated as a prisoner. In Gaza, the humiliation was even crueler. The Philistines didn't just imprison him, they also gouged out his eyes. With a fatal blow, they removed his eyes, rendering Samson completely powerless. Imagine the pain he must have felt, not only physically but emotionally, realizing that he, who once had supernatural strength, could now not even see his enemies. He was blind, not just in his eyes but also in the loss of his strength, in the breaking of his covenant with God. As if that wasn't enough, the Philistines didn't leave him in just any prison. Samson was forced to do the most humiliating work of all, grinding grain. The image of such a strong man now working as a slave is sad and powerful. He, who once destroyed entire armies with his own hands, was now at a mill, turning the heavy wheel to grind the grain. All his power and pride had been stripped away, and he found himself reduced to nothing, a shadow of the man he once was. But what seems to be the end of everything, the darkest moment, is not the end of Samson's story. Samson's fall is a metaphor for how humiliation and defeat can, paradoxically, be a point of transformation. He was imprisoned, blind, and humiliated, but somehow, there was still a thread of hope in his heart. God had not abandoned Samson. Even at the lowest point, God was still shaping him for the great moment of his redemption. This moment is a turning point in Samson's story because it is here that we see the contrast between his fall and the beginning of his recovery. He, now completely broken, finds himself in a place where God can act in a surprising way. In a moment of great humiliation and weakness, Samson found himself imprisoned, blind, and completely powerless. He, who had been one of the most powerful judges of Israel, was now shackled and ridiculed by the Philistines, the enemies of God's people. His hair, which had once symbolized his strength, was gone, and everything seemed lost. The man who had destroyed temples, killed 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone, and accomplished impossible feats, was now at the mercy of his enemies. But deep in his heart, Samson still had faith. Even in his imprisonment, he remembered God's promises and the divine strength that had once enabled him to do great things. Without his eyes to guide him, but with his soul still firm in God, he felt that the moment had come for one final cry. The sense of weakness was overwhelming, but in his spirit, a final spark of hope began to ignite. And then, with a broken heart, Samson made the most sincere cry of his life. He raised his voice to the heavens, and in his prayer, he asked for something simple, yet profoundly meaningful: "Lord God, remember me. Give me strength, Lord, just this once, and I will take revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson knew he could not do this by his own strength, but that only God could restore his power. He surrendered to God, acknowledging his total dependence on divine grace. Samson's cry was not just a plea for power, but a request for redemption. Above all, he wanted to fulfill the purpose for which God had called him, and he knew that even in his weakness, God could use him. In that moment of hopelessness, Samson made a humble and sincere prayer, and God, in his mercy, responded. Samson's strength, which seemed to have been lost forever, began to return. God not only granted him physical power but also renewed his determination and courage. With renewed faith and restored strength, Samson prepared to face his enemies once again, now with a greater purpose than before, not only to defeat the Philistines but to glorify the name of God. In a moment of great humiliation and weakness, Samson found himself imprisoned, blind, and completely powerless. He, who had been one of the most powerful judges of Israel, was now shackled and ridiculed by the Philistines, the enemies of God's people. His hair, which had once symbolized his strength, was gone, and everything seemed lost. The man who had destroyed temples, killed 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone, and accomplished impossible feats, was now at the mercy of his enemies. But deep in his heart, Samson still had faith. Even in his imprisonment, he remembered God's promises and the divine strength that had once enabled him to do great things. Without his eyes to guide him, but with his soul still firm in God, he felt that the moment had come for one final cry. The sense of weakness was overwhelming, but in his spirit, a final spark of hope began to ignite. And then, with a broken heart, Samson made the most sincere cry of his life. He raised his voice to the heavens, and in his prayer, he asked for something simple, yet profoundly meaningful. Lord God, remember me. Give me strength, Lord, just this once, and I will take revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson knew he could not do this by his own strength, but that only God could restore his power. He surrendered to God, acknowledging his total dependence on divine grace. Samson's cry was not just a plea for power, but a request for redemption. Above all, he wanted to fulfill the purpose for which God had called him, and he knew that even in his weakness, God could use him. In that moment of hopelessness, Samson made a humble and sincere prayer, and God, in his mercy, responded. Samson's strength, which seemed to have been lost forever, began to return. God not only granted him physical power but also renewed his determination and courage. With renewed faith and restored strength, Samson prepared to face his enemies once again, now with a greater purpose than before, not only to defeat the Philistines but to glorify the name of God. It was a day of great celebration for the Philistines. The people, who had been tormented by Samson for so many years, were finally celebrating their victory over the man who had been their nightmare. They had managed to capture him, and now, they believed they were about to ridicule him once and for all. Samson, the man of supernatural strength, was now completely vulnerable. His hair had been cut, and his strength had disappeared. His eyes had been gouged out in a brutal act of humiliation. The scene was cruel. The man who once killed a lion with his own hands was now just a shadow of what he had been. The Philistines gathered in large numbers at the temple of Dagon, their god. The temple was immense, with great pillars supporting the high ceiling. It was the center of a grand celebration, where the Philistines were offering sacrifices and worshipping their god, thinking they had achieved a great victory. There, amidst all the glory and fanfare, were the Philistine leaders, seated on their thrones, ready to mock Samson. They had brought him back from the dungeon, as a spectacle of defeat, and now he stood before them, chained and blind. Samson, who had once been a hero to his people, was now the main attraction of a humiliation show. They laughed and enjoyed themselves, showing how they had defeated the one who seemed invincible. He stood there, in the center of the temple, exposed for all to see. The crowd was in a frenzy, singing, dancing, and making all kinds of mockery. The joy of the Philistines seemed endless, for to them, Samson was more than a defeated man. He was proof that the power of God was nothing but an illusion. But even in this moment of great humiliation, there was something Samson could not lose: his trust in the God of Israel. Though captive and weak, he had not lost his faith. The spectacle continued, and the Philistines' enjoyment went on, but Samson was not there just to be the target of their laughter. Inside him, something began to change. He asked the young men who were guiding him, for he could no longer see, to take him to the pillars that supported the temple. "Let me lean against the pillars," Samson requested, not revealing his intentions. Those guiding him did not realize what was about to happen. They placed him there, in the center of the temple, between the two great pillars that seemed to be the key to the building's stability. Samson, now with his hands touching the pillars, took a deep breath. He knew he was about to do something extraordinary, something that would change the fate of the Philistines and perhaps even his own. The joy of the crowd was deafening. They had no idea what was about to happen. But Samson, even in his blind and captive state, knew that the God of Israel was still with him. He prayed, with unwavering faith, asking the Lord to give him strength one last time. "O Lord, remember me. I ask you only this once, O God, that you strengthen me so that I may avenge the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And then, in a moment of pure trust and boldness, Samson used all his strength, which was divine, to push the pillars. The temple began to shake, and with a deafening roar, the great pillars started to give way. The ceiling collapsed, crushing not only the Philistines in the temple but also the princes and rulers who were present at the celebration. The destruction was total, and the glory of the Philistines was quickly turned into tragedy. Samson, in his final sacrifice, took more Philistines with him than in all his previous life. He, who had been humiliated, now became an instrument of justice in the hands of God. The temple that celebrated his defeat became the stage of his final victory, and Samson's death, which seemed to be the end, was actually a beginning of the fall of the Philistines, which extended for many generations. And so, at the moment of greatest humiliation, God used Samson's weakness to fulfill his purpose. The celebration of the Philistines, which seemed eternal, was interrupted in an impressive way, reminding everyone that, no matter how much they tried to mock God, He always has the final word. The setting was a gigantic temple, embedded in the heart of a great Philistine celebration. The crowd was ecstatic, laughing and celebrating. Samson, now captive, his eyes gouged out, was chained to a rock, being ridiculed and humiliated in front of everyone. The Philistines, who had defeated this powerful man, rejoiced in their victory. They saw Samson as nothing more than a big joke, someone whom the God of Israel seemed to have abandoned. But Samson, although physically weak, never lost his faith. Sitting there, with the Philistines laughing around him, something deep and intense was happening in his heart. He knew that his life, although marked by mistakes and weaknesses, could still serve for something great, something that would fulfill God's purpose. Then, Samson made a request. He asked the young men who were guiding him to the temple to place him between the 2 great columns that supported the building. He felt the columns beneath his hands. The structure seemed solid, unshakable. But in his soul, he knew everything was about to crumble. The temple was a symbol of the Philistines' power, and Samson was about to do the impossible. With the weight of weakness on his shoulders and a renewed trust in God, Samson prayed fervently. In his prayer, he asked for strength one last time. "Lord God, remember me, I beg you, and strengthen me just this one more time, O God, that with one blow I may avenge my blindness and the death of my brothers." Samson was prepared for a final sacrifice, knowing that he would not leave there alive. He had nothing left to lose, but he knew that his sacrifice, although bitter, would bring liberation to his people. With his hands firmly placed on the columns, he used what little strength he had left. The crowd, still laughing and enjoying themselves, had no idea what was about to happen. The room was full of Philistines, leaders, nobles, all rejoicing in their victory over Israel, and Samson, standing there before them, was about to reverse the situation. With a shout that reverberated through the temple, he pushed the columns with all the strength he could muster. And then, like an earthquake, the great columns began to give way. The temple shook. The ground trembled. The sky seemed to close in on the earth. The stones began to fall, the walls cracked, and the sound of the collapse echoed in every corner. The grand celebration turned into chaos. Thousands of unsuspecting Philistines were swallowed up by the destruction. The temple completely collapsed, and Samson's strength, allied with the power of God, brought down Israel's enemies once and for all. The final scene was stunning. Samson's death was not in vain. At the darkest moment of his life, he made the final gesture of courage that would reflect his entire life: sacrifice. He killed more Philistines in his death than in his entire life before. Samson's sacrifice brought victory, not only for him but for all the people of Israel. Now, the scene is dark, full of tension and expectation. The great Philistine temple is filled with people. Crowds gather to celebrate their victory over Samson, the man who had terrorized them with his supernatural strength. He, now blind and a prisoner, was brought there to be mocked, ridiculed, and humiliated. His eyes, which once saw the greatness of God's creation and the marvelous deeds of his strength, were now empty, lifeless, blind due to the betrayal of Delilah. The joy of the Philistines was in his suffering. They believed they had finally defeated the man who had been used by God to cause them so much damage. Samson, with his last strength, feels the weight of his condition. He is being dragged, bound, and the humiliation is at its peak. But within his heart, something begins to ignite. He knows that his purpose has not yet been fulfilled. The call of God upon his life is still alive, even in his weakness. As the celebration continues, the laughter and mockery of the Philistines echo through the temple. Samson, being led to the center of the great building, is placed between the temple's columns, which support the weight of the entire structure. He feels the weight of the building upon him, and the image of the people of Israel, still under the rule of the Philistines, begins to fill his thoughts. He remembers what God had promised. He recalls the divine calling that had always guided him, and that, even though he had failed at many moments, was still there, waiting to be fulfilled. With his hands still bound, Samson asks a young man to guide him to the columns. The request seems simple, but it carries a deep weight. He wants to position himself between those columns for one last act, something that would be both a revenge and a redemptive sacrifice. He knows that his life will end at that moment, but he also knows that Israel's victory over the Philistines will come through his death. And then, amidst the chaos and mockery, Samson lifts his voice, now in a silent but powerful prayer. He calls upon the Lord, asking for divine strength one last time, the strength that once made him invincible. He acknowledges his weakness, but does not give up. "O Lord God, remember me. I ask you only this time, give me strength so that I may avenge the death of my eyes and defeat the Philistines." The greatness of the moment is indescribable. Suddenly, he feels the strength of the Lord upon him once again. His muscles, which were weak and tired, are filled with new life. He pushes the columns with all his might. The temple begins to tremble. The laughter and screams of the Philistines turn into cries of fear, for they do not understand what is happening. The power of God, which had been with Samson since the moment of his birth, manifests irresistibly. With one final effort, Samson brings down the columns, and the temple begins to collapse. The crumbling of the building is like the fulfillment of the divine purpose. The walls fall, and the sound of the collapse is deafening. Samson, with his last strength, sacrifices his life so that the Philistines would be defeated. It was not just the destruction of a temple, but the destruction of the oppressive power that had dominated the people of Israel for so long. Samson's great strength, given by God, was not just in his ability to win physical battles but in his total surrender, in the sacrifice he made to fulfill the divine purpose. His death was not a defeat, but an act of redemption. The people of Israel, though in silence, knew that this man had fulfilled what God expected of him, beginning the liberation of Israel from the Philistine domination. And so, the story of Samson ends, not in shame, but with the courage of a man who, in his final sacrifice, fulfilled God's plan. Through his death, Israel would take the first step toward freedom, and Samson's legacy would be remembered not for his physical strength but for his courage in facing his destiny with faith.